Well, good day, everybody. And unfortunately, the situation, as you all are aware of, is not getting better but worse. To start off with a short update on the situation in Gaza, the fighting around the Al-Shifa hospital, which has been denounced by every humanitarian organization around the world, it's still ongoing. The situation is absolutely unbearable. The reports about children crying for milk, there's no food, no water. So finally, the famous story about that the headquarters of Hamas supposedly was under this hospital has proven to be absolutely untrue. All they found was 3 bags of employees with some weapons in it, but very, very far from what the claim was. Also, the only tunnels which were found were those connecting some of the hospital buildings, which is quite normal. I mean, every major government building has such tunnels underneath and no connection to Hamas tunnels whatsoever. Now, unfortunately, this is not the only situation, but there are now reports that leaflets were thrown over a city called Khan Yunis, which is a town in the south of Gaza, and there were 3 other towns where also such leaflets were thrown down, warning people that they should absolutely leave these towns because everybody in the vicinity of terrorists would put their lives in danger. Now, similar leaflets were thrown over cities and towns in the north of Gaza before the IDF started their ground offensive. So, unfortunately, the signs that there is actually a plan for ethnic cleansing and the depopulation of Gaza, one cannot overlook these signs at all. There are reports mooting that the idea is to drive everybody either into the Sinai in direction of Egypt or Jordan from the West Bank from there. So I think that is an untenable situation. I think the death toll is now almost 12,000 people, 3,500 more missing, maybe hidden under the rubble of the collapsed buildings. About 70% of these people are children, women, elderly, and sick. So the absolute humanitarian catastrophe is absolutely continuing. Now, the other major event was naturally the summit between the United States and China. President Biden and President Xi Jinping met in San Francisco at the before the APEC meeting, and I have to say that this was in an ocean of horrors, a tiny, tiny sign that there may be a solution by re-establishing some kind of rationality in the international order. I think the Chinese readout made it very clear that the choice there was between a world of joint solidarity and prosperity on the one side, or a world of a zero-sum game and conflict and strife on the other side. And it seems that at least for the time being, the a certain amount of diplomacy was re-established, which obviously did not prevent President Biden from calling President Xi Jinping a dictator in the following press conference, answering to a obviously provocative question from some reporter. And unfortunately, it did also not stop the further delivery of weapons from the United States to Israel, which comes down to a condoning of whatever Israel is doing, or not only condoning but actually enabling. So I think that we need to absolutely gear our own mobilization into a higher gear, because obviously as we said from the beginning, the only way how the international peace movement can have the necessary impact is that we unite all forces, because there are many people doing things, rallies, demonstrations, letters, appeals, but as long as they are not unified in one single voice, it will not be sufficient, which is why we will have a special event on the 26th of October. This is a Sunday. We will hear about that more from Dennis Speed. And we also will have the first, hopefully in a whole series, of an international university conference organized by Nicaragua to discuss the absolute need to have an international new security and development architecture which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet. And the event on the November 6th will focus not only on what is happening in Gaza, but also on the absolute need to immediately put on the table an economic development plan for the entire Southwest Asian region. So I think these are some of the initial remarks I wanted to make. I can only ask everybody to, really help in this effort, because it is like the clock is running down, and it is only the peace-loving people of the world who can make a difference. So that's really all I wanted to say in the beginning.
The introduction that you saw from Helga uh, uh, could have been made was actually something that she discussed yesterday, or for the International Peace Coalition, and what she put forward was she put forward an idea that the the conception of taking these people who have been working with her on the organization that she created, Helga Zepp LaRouche being the founder and chairman of the Schiller Institute, that her conception of organization has now become increasingly discussed among various forces in various parts of the world. We don't have the occasion right now to go through much of this, given the problem of my having been muted. I think what we'll do is we'll go right to Harley Schlanger. I wanted to say something about the fact that Harley's work in the last 5 weeks, people have been commenting and writing in. Actually, we got a few messages even today concerning the how to address the crisis in Southwest Asia. We want to make sure that you follow this. If you need to see some of the earlier excerpts, we're going to be compiling them separately, but so they'll be available at this site. So Harley, why don't we go right to you for interest of both of time, and also let me say one thing which I was saying as I was muted about LaRouche and Henry Kissinger. The policies that people see right now in Southwest Asia, the policies that of war, are the legacy of the suppression of the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche by Henry Kissinger, starting in 1975, when LaRouche had proposed his International Development Bank policies. Subsequent policies, which caused Lyndon LaRouche to be deemed anti-Semitic, many of you who are out there now are suffering the same epithet, were because of the fact of these ideas of LaRouche's. And had those ideas been adopted at the time, we wouldn't be talking here and sitting here looking at this destruction of Gaza and Palestine. So, Harley, go right ahead.
Well, I think everyone just got to see that the only one who can mute Dennis is himself. But
I'm not sure that's what happened. I'm not sure that's what occurred, but that seems to be. Okay.
All right. Well, I'm glad you're unmuted. And I'm going to start out by taking up the theme from Helga, where she said there are tiny signs of hope in an ocean of instability and horrors. I'll be followed by my colleague Bill Jones, who will talk about the China situation, the Biden-Xi Jinping meeting, which for Helga was at least a starting point for reversing the collapse of relations between the two countries. But I want to start with a couple of examples of a change that's starting to occur. We've seen many people in the streets all over the world. In London, in a big demonstration for next Saturday in Berlin, demonstrations throughout the United States, in Israel, in Paris, where there's a mobilization to stop the war against the Palestinians in Gaza. Now, to stop the war doesn't mean support for Hamas. It means to break the cycle of violence. And that's basically what I'm going to be discussing in my presentation today. Let me start with some comments that were made by a U.S. Senator from Georgia, John Ossoff, which are a very important intervention because there are very few people in the Congress with the courage to speak up on this situation. Could I have the first slide, please? Here's what Senator Ossoff said. He said the extent of civilian death and suffering in Gaza is unnecessary. It's a moral failure and should be unacceptable to the United States. An unmitigated humanitarian disaster in Gaza undermines American national security. It heightens the risk that the war might be spread and draw American forces further into combat. It sows the seeds of hate and dims the prospects for a long-term sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians. It gives fodder to terrorists who would strike Americans and our allies abroad and at home. It damages the credibility of the United States and our allies as champions of a future defined by humanitarian values. And he concluded with the following remarks. If in 6 months Gaza is rubble and tens of thousands of civilians dead and millions of desperate refugees with no viable plan to govern its ruins, that would be a disaster, not just for all those killed and wounded and immiserated, but also for Israel, for the region, and for the United States. Now, what Ossoff just described is an unfolding of a tragedy. And as many of you know, tragedies don't have to occur. Tragedies occur when the prevailing axioms of a society and the corruption of a leadership combine so that there's no action taken to right the wrongs. Now, Ossoff ended by saying that Israel has ignored the U.S. requests for a more targeted campaign and has failed to present a credible plan for Gaza's future. Now, that's a starting point for change. The problem is most Democrats are continuing to support Biden on the war that Israel is waging in Gaza. And similarly, most Republicans are even more vociferously in support of this war. And here's the paradox. We saw the Republican Party moving against the neocon war, the NATO proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. Some of them because they didn't want to spend the money, but many because they realized it was a losing piece of action that Ukraine couldn't win. The money was actually a secondary issue, although they made that the primary issue. The primary issue is that we were heading toward a potential wider war that could become nuclear. And many in the Republican Party started moving against it. So the neocons and the hawks pulled a trick. They used the Gaza situation to get the Republicans back into the Bush, Cheney, neocon, Wolfowitz doctrine mentality of the United States being the first nation to use the most force to win something. Now, they're not willing to put the United States yet into battle, although people like Lindsey Graham are, but they're defending what the Israelis are doing, what Netanyahu is doing. So I just want to build on this question of what Ossoff said to show you that there's motion internationally for a ceasefire and against this war. You had, of all places, the Los Angeles Times had an editorial yesterday, "Ceasefire now, the killing in Gaza must stop." And it goes on to say that the Hamas atrocities do not justify Israeli atrocities, which should seem to be a natural conception. In human society, when in history has a violent repression in reaction to something that was unacceptable, how often has that brought peace? It almost always leads to an escalation. And so the idea that somehow the Israeli strikes on Gaza will bring peace is pure lunacy. Now, similarly, you have a poll in Israel, which shows that if elections were held today, Netanyahu's coalition would lose 19 seats. It would lose its majority status and would no longer be able to govern. Polls in Israel are showing that while people want to defeat Hamas, Netanyahu to get the credit for it because many of them blame him for the events of October 7th. Now, we also have a very interesting statement from the Foreign Ministry of Iran. And as you know, there's a targeting operation going on against Iran. People like Lindsey Graham and many others, David Petraeus, the Fred Kemp of the Atlantic Council, are saying, look, we have to smash Hamas quickly so we can get on to the real problem, which is Iran. So they want to continue the wars. Now, the Iranian foreign minister addressed this problem of U.S. hypocrisy. He said the U.S. is calling on Iran to exercise restraint. Well, Iran is not technically in this. The idea is that supposedly Iran's proxies are preparing for war, whether it's Hezbollah. Many people call Hamas an Iran proxy, but it's not. But the foreign minister said, you're calling on Iran to exercise restraint while the U.S. is providing complete support for an escalation by Israel against the Palestinians. I would say that that's not just the Iranian foreign minister who sees that. That's many of the leaders of the nations of the global south who in the United Nations have been voting for resolutions for a ceasefire. Yesterday, Turkish President Erdogan was in Berlin to meet with Chancellor Scholz and President Steinmeier. And while Erdogan is a very strong opponent of what the Netanyahu regime is doing, nevertheless, he made the pitch for a two-state solution and the idea of a lasting comprehensive peace, which is what the Chinese and others are calling for. And Scholz and Steinmeier agreed with him. So we see that there's, on the broader diplomatic level, there's motion. There's recognition of reality. And the reality is that however much is put into this war, the outcome will not be what people want. It may be that the immediate leadership of Hamas is wiped out, but the seeds have been planted for the next round of the violent reaction. Now, in this context, let's take a look at what the Netanyahu regime is doing. Yesterday, the Netanyahu government announced that they will allow 2 fuel trucks a day that will provide between 2 to 4% of the fuel needed in Gaza. And why are they doing that? Well, they say on the one side it's for humanitarian purposes. And the lack of drinkable water and the presence of untreated sewage could lead to diseases and epidemics. But they then went on to say that the reason they're concerned about this is not because of the effect on the Palestinians, but because it might spread to the IDF forces, the Israeli Defense Forces that are in Gaza. Besides, 2 to 4% of the needs amounts to almost nothing. There are children starving to death in Gaza now. The idea that the Israelis are pushing the residents of Gaza now to move to the south. So they sent them from the north to the south. Now they're saying you have to go even further to the south. Where are they supposed to go? Now, what's interesting is that there was opposition to the provision of these 2 to 4% fuel that's needed in Gaza. It came from the extreme hardliners, the racist Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security advisor, who's a follower of the disgraced racist Meir Kahane, and Smotrich, who's the finance minister. They said this is unacceptable to provide even drops of fuel. They accused Netanyahu of backing down in this situation. And then there was the article in the Wall Street Journal written by 2 Knesset members who said that the solution is to get every country in the world to take 10,000 Palestinians. In other words, move them all out of Palestine, get them out, have other countries take them in. This is supposedly the solution that's being proposed and discussed in Israel. Now, in what moral universe can one say that atrocities committed by one side justifies atrocities by the other. All you do when you accept that is you're freeing the victims of atrocities to victimize others with atrocities. That's not a strategy for peace. And the problem is we need more than a ceasefire. And this is where we get to the actual solutions that have been presented by Helga Zepp-LaRouche of the Schiller Institute and the mobilization of the International Peace Coalition. That what's needed is a new security and development architecture. And we've talked a lot about the Peace of Westphalia as a model, and I just want to go through a little bit of that to give you a sense of the difference between merely a ceasefire on the one side or a scorched earth, kill them all policy on the other. Those are not the only options. The other option is this new security architecture. Now, the Peace of Westphalia ended 140 years of religious warfare, almost 150 years throughout Europe. And it ended the 30 Years' War, which was the last of these religious wars, in 1648. And it had within it the concept of the sovereignty, the principle of sovereignty of states, the right to self-determination, which is that there's not one model that's acceptable, which is, of course, the unipolar order has that as an idea, but that each nation can determine for itself its economic policies, its religion, based on religious and cultural differences. So it basically recognizes what is sometimes called multipolarity. It also included within it the idea of non-intervention in the internal affairs of other nations. I want to put up a couple of sections of the actual articles in the Peace of Westphalia for you to see. The first one says, this peace must be so honest and seriously guarded and nourished that each part furthers the advantage, honor, and benefit of the other. A faithful neighborliness should be renewed and flourish for peace and friendship. Peace among sovereign nations requires, in other words, according to this principle, that each nation develops itself fully and regards it as its self-interest to develop the others fully, and vice versa. And then to reiterate that, they have the second article, which states, on both sides, all should be forever forgotten and forgiven. All violent acts, damages, etc., should be completely put aside so that everything will be forgotten to eternity. Now, the two concepts there that are so important, the benefit of the other and forgiveness. This is the principle of Christian love, which was what put an end to the wars between Christian factions in Europe. This works as an ecumenical principle, going back to Nicholas of Cusa and the idea of the peace among the faiths. Why should religions that all have a one God conception, that honor that one God, that see themselves as being created in the image and likeness of that God, why should they be fighting? Why can they not find solutions? Now, there was an article in the Fidelio magazine, which was also reprinted in the Executive Intelligence Review, on the Treaty of Westphalia. And one of the concepts that came out in this was the idea that the author, Pierre Baudry, put in, the economics of generosity. The idea of the benefit of the other. Well, this is something that is central to the work of Lyndon LaRouche over his whole life. The idea that peace comes from mutual development, and it comes from development based on the principle that all human beings are potentially creative, can make discoveries in science, can apply those scientific discoveries to new technology, in other words, new modes of production, that will increase the bounty of all societies, and that's what should govern relations between nations. That is the principle in economics of the benefit of the other. And the article that I referenced by Pierre Baudry, which was in the EIR on May 30th, 2003, has a whole section on how this was carried through by the work by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the French leader who put together a group in Paris, a scientific academy, which at one point included Gottfried Leibniz was working there, But what they were looking at is how could you increase the trade within Europe using rivers, canals, a policy with which Colbert called the industrial commonwealth policy. This is the concept of physical economy that was transmitted through Leibniz to Ben Franklin, to the American founding fathers. That's why the American Revolution was an anti-colonial revolution, with the idea that we would develop in the United States a model of economics and freedom that would be universally applicable, not as an imposed rules-based order, but because it worked, because these principles of economics represent natural law, and that societies should be organized around such conceptions. Now, that was, if you think about what Colbert was doing by saying that the peace could be continued through more commerce between nations, by using corridors of development at that time, which were canals and so on, later railroads, that this was the essence that was picked up by Lyndon LaRouche in his Oasis plan, that you can use these kinds of infrastructure projects both to increase the connectedness of countries that would have cultural benefits and economic benefits, but also would serve as corridors of development. So a discovery in one country could be transmitted to another country. Again, that's the basis of this idea of the benefit of the other. Now, that should be accepted by everyone. Well, not Tony Blair. In 1999, Blair gave a speech at the Economics Club of Chicago, where he put forward a different doctrine, what he called a new post-Westphalian doctrine of the international community. In other words, he explicitly attacked the idea of Westphalia. He called it an anachronistic conception. And he was giving this speech precisely at the point at which NATO was bombing Yugoslavia. And he was arguing that this represents a new principle that is due to globalization. He explicitly said that under globalization, the Westphalian principle is no longer acceptable. Now, this was picked up by the neocons, who later said that any nation which doesn't respect democratic principles, this is the Wolfowitz doctrine, Cheney, Bush, and so on, the authors of the idea of the unipolar order, that any nation which doesn't respect democratic principles is a legitimate target of a just war by the democracies. So again, democracy versus authoritarian. You divide the world into the power of the empire to impose its will on any country that doesn't go along. And this was formalized later in the doctrine called the responsibility to protect. Blair's 1999 speech was picked up by, among others, a group in Canada, and the Canadian government established what was called the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. And they put out a report in 2001, December 2001, titled The Responsibility to Protect. And it basically said when a population is suffering serious harm, such as mass murder or starvation, non-intervention must yield to the responsibility to protect. Now, what that essentially defines is an interventionary policy to defend the globalized cartels, that the principles of mutual benefit get thrown out the window. Instead, power, the might makes right. That's the essence of the unipolar order. And when Blinken self-righteously tells nations that they're breaking with the rules-based order, the legitimate question is, which are the rules? Because Blinken, through his work with Biden and his work before that with Obama, was violating international rules. The overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014, that was a violation of Westphalia. The 2011 destruction of Libya, that violated international law. The invasion of Iraq in 2003. That violated international law. So in order to supposedly protect the rules of the rules-based order, that gives the strongest power the right to violate international law. And we're seeing that same principle again in the Israeli attack on Gaza. Now, I won't say more on this Westphalian principle and Blair's attack on it. Maybe in the Q&A we can take it up. But I want to come back to the other aspect of this situation. And if I could have the third poster. There's a great deal of fear in Ukraine that the Ukraine war is being forgotten and that the Gaza war is the new flavor of the day. So Jake Sullivan said something, I think it was yesterday, to try to get the Biden bill for $100+ billion for the two wars and preparing for a third war against China. What Sullivan said is that each week that passes without a new bill, and by the way, the budget deal that just passed did not include this $105 billion authorization that Biden wanted for Ukraine and Israel. So Sullivan said each week that passes without a new bill to do that, our ability to fully fund what we feel is necessary to give Ukraine the tools and capacities it needs to both defend its territory and to continue to make advances, that gets harder and harder. Now, concretely, what does that mean? Well, it was announced yesterday in a seminar at the Atlantic Council that Ukraine is running out of 155 millimeter shells. Why? Because the US is now sending them to Israel. And so the Ukraine situation, which is another unjust war, that is the proxy war in Ukraine, is not Russia attacking Ukraine, it's Russia defending universal principles from Ukrainian neo-Nazis who were bombing the populations in the Donbass. And Putin tried for 8 years to get an agreement to stop it. And he never was able to because the West is committed to a policy of isolating Russia and breaking Russia apart. And so what's happening in Ukraine is a great deal of panic now because it's clear that the war can't be won. Does that mean the United States is now going to move away and dump Ukraine the way it's done with many other allies in the past? Well, I'm sure Zelensky is having very many uneasy nights. But the fact is that the reason for all of this is the rejection of the principle of the benefit of the other. This must become the ironclad principle that governs nations. And what it means is that you need to have somewhere where there can be discussion. And at this point, the United Nations is the one place where that could work, where nations can sit down and discuss how to resolve these kinds of problems. And the place to start is if you look at what I mentioned briefly about what Colbert's policy was for Europe after the Peace of Westphalia, that's the idea of the Oasis Plan that Lyndon LaRouche introduced, which became, to a large degree, the conception that was embedded within the Oslo Accord, peace between Israel and the Palestinians that was signed in 1993. Are such things impossible? Well, it's going to take principal leaders, rather, who act on those principles. Since we don't have very many of them, it falls upon the population to insist on it, to demand it. And when we see polls that show that 2/3 or more of the US population is opposed to more arms to Ukraine, well, maybe that's started to get through to the Congress. But we're also seeing polls that show that more than 2/3 of the US population wants a ceasefire in Israel. Why hasn't that gotten through to Biden? I think it's because not enough people have been out mobilizing to make that happen. And that's what Helga was talking about in the clip you saw at the beginning about the International Peace Coalition. I really urge everyone watching this video to study this idea of the Peace of Westphalia and to look at what its breakdown means in terms of the perpetual warfare which the United States has been engaged in because of the role of the neocons and neoliberals in both parties. A lot of people write to me and say, it's the Democrats, the Democrats and the left, it's socialism, it's this, it's that. Come on. The hardcore Republican conservatives are now embracing Biden's war in Gaza, just as for the longest time they voted for all the money to go to Ukraine. If the United States is to return to its tradition as a sovereign republic, everyone has to be committed to return to this principle of Westphalia. Those people who say they're for sovereignty, but then support these wars, are only fooling themselves. The problem is people are dying because of this. So stop fooling yourself, stop falling into these traps, join with us, and if you're already organizing with us, take from us some ideas and develop them yourself for how to use the hypocrisy of the other side to get people to see how they're being manipulated. As LaRouche said, they're being played from above like puppets. And that's the way these wars get started, and they only end when the puppet strings are cut, including the puppet strings on ourselves. So that's what I wanted to say, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you, Harley. And if you've just joined us, you were just listening to Harley Schlanger, spokesman for the LaRouche organization. I want to make you aware now of announce an emergency forum of the International Peace Coalition, which is going to be happening on Sunday, November 26th. There's only 8 days from now. It's called No More War Crimes, Economic Development, Not Depopulation. Speakers will include Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Schiller Institute founder and head, and Ray McGovern, who is a co-founder of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. This will be at 11 a.m. on Sunday, November 26th. And the reason we're doing it at that time is we want to have as widespread international participation as we can get. And because of the time zone differences, we're going to start early. Now, at the conclusion of the presentations and discussion that Ray McGovern and Helga will be doing, there will then be a showing of the film Hiroshima 815, a true story of survival and forgiveness from Hiroshima. This is the book that is the subject from which the movie was taken. This is the side that was not shown in the recent Hollywood film Oppenheimer. What happened to people on the ground? What happened to people who are at ground zero? And what will happen is that we will show the film, which is about an hour, and we will then be joined by the author, Dr. Akiko Mikamu, who will be answering questions about the film, about the book, and her father. Now, as we have said, and that forum on the 26th, which again is no more war crimes, economic development, not depopulation. We are going to be talking about what has to be done, and have been talking for a long time about what has to be done for the area of Southwest Asia. In order to really do that, we have to tell you about the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, or rather, we have to let Lyndon LaRouche speak for himself. What we have is an excerpt from a presentation that he gave in Abu Dhabi at the Zayed Center. This was in the United Arab Emirates. This was on June 2nd, 2002. The whole presentation was called The Middle East as a Strategic Crossroad. But what we've done is to put an excerpt in now. And after the excerpt, we're going to ask for both Harley and Bill to respond to what they've seen there. And I think we have a couple of questions for Harley. We'll also take at that point. So if we can have the video.
In any sane order of the world's strategic economic affairs, Middle East oil will continue to be an outstanding factor in the petroleum supplies of the world economy for at least a generation yet to come. This would be so for what should be implicitly obvious economic reasons. However, as in all matters of current world affairs, given the desperate situation of the world today, we cannot be so naive as to presume that powers which may be great, or even simply powerful, will react sanely to the relevant strategic facts of the situation. I focus on the subject of oil, but do that within the context of the historically determined strategic options for a Middle East which is defined in its ancient and continuing role as a crucial strategic crossroads of Eurasia, and Africa. After defining that context, I shall return our attention to petroleum as such, situating the production and marketing of petroleum as a presently crucial factor of vital strategic importance for the Middle East as a region, with special ecological and implicit cultural qualities. I concentrate on three distinct interacting factors to be considered in the attempt to forecast the prospects of the region and also its petroleum. First, the ecological, second, the economic, and thirdly, the political strategic factors. To begin, zoom in as if from an orbiting space station upon the past and present ecology of this region of the world's biosphere. In our imagination, let us watch the long-range historical process of the melting of the Great Eurasian Glacier over the interval from about 19,000 years ago, when ocean levels were approximately 400 feet below the present those today. Watch the evolution of the Mediterranean region over the following millennia. Watch the later phase of the great desiccation of the once rich desert regions of Sahara, the Gulf, and Central Asia. From the standpoint of that lapsed time panorama, we are reminded in the most useful way of a fact we already know, that the most critical of the strategic economic factors inside the Middle East region as a whole is not petroleum, but fresh water. The characteristic of that portion of a predominantly Islamic civilization, westward from the Middle East and across Northern Africa, is a continuing struggle against aridization, which has continued during approximately the past 6,000 to 8,000 years. Today, we have the scientific potential to begin to control, if not entirely reverse, the effects of that post-glacial process. It is the principal strategic ecological challenge which obstructs the realization of an otherwise great potential. The potential which has existed for the greater part of 2 millennia in Arab civilization. It is to the degree that we make significant steps toward applying and improving the methods for production and distribution of fresh water, that other crucial factors of development can be brought into play. In that case, we shall see the implicit strategic potential of the Middle East as the crossroads of Eurasia. Any long-term forecast of the prospects of Middle East petroleum must be studied in the context of that challenge. The development of freshwater production and management, which is interlinked with the role of petroleum, is the indispensable foundation for all optimistic prospects for a peaceful and politically stable internal development of the Middle East as a region. If people lack the essential means to live, there is no peace. They will live in successive waves of land piracy, including the Mongol Empire, as they swept into Europe and the Middle East from across Eurasia in times past under pressure of aridization. There will be no peace without adequate provision of water. This brings me to the pivotal economic issues. For this purpose, view the Middle East's greatest economic potential as a whole, as a pivotal economic strategic crossroads for Eurasia as a whole. While the Suez Canal's strategic importance of the link between the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean is obvious, I shall indicate why the cross-land routes across the Middle East are far more crucial forms of transport for Eurasia as a whole than for the Africa-Asia connections. It is a simple fact of accounting. The cost of transporting a product, as for example by sea, or by other means, must be compared with the cost of production of that product up to the point of embarkation. Therefore, we tend to transport products such as petroleums and grains, which have a relatively lower price per ton, by slower, cheaper water transport. The more useful work as value added to the product, as it moves through various phases of production, lessens the percentile of the cost of transporting the value represented by that product as a whole. Therefore, the more real value added by production to a raw or semi-finished material, the greater the relative prosperity from the export of the products, the greater it adds to the exporting nation or region of the nation. This has always been understood by the greatest economists and statesmen of the Americas and Europe since about 150 years ago. And till modern times, transport by water continued to be the principal roadway of progress in the material conditions of human life. This continued until approximately 170 years ago, when the German-American economist Friedrich List outlined what became the railway revolution. This development was accelerated by the successful development of the U.S. transcontinental railway system as a development of crucial importance for the U.S. emergence as a leading world economic power under our President Abraham Lincoln. After 1876, American methods, typified by the development of the American transcontinental railway system, were adopted in Germany, Russia, Japan, and elsewhere, including China. And admittedly, the attempt to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific eastward by rail, as the U.S. had connected the Atlantic to the Pacific westward, was seen by the British Empire as a threat to that empire's strategic maritime supremacy in the world as a whole, with two so-called geopolitical wars of the 20th century as a result. Admittedly, there is an influential utopian faction inside the U.S. today, which is prepared to unleash a geopolitical war throughout continental Eurasia for the purpose of preventing the internal development of the mainlands of Asia and Africa. These geopolitical policies are contrary to all rational definitions of the interests of the U.S. economy, which is itself now racked by an onrushing world monetary financial collapse. Unfortunately, those policies exist among presently very influential circles. Whatever U.S. policy might appear to be now, the reality of the present world economic crisis will probably force some sweeping changes in U.S. policy and thinking during the near future. There is no hope for the economic revival of the United States from the present world crisis without precisely such cooperation in the land transport-based development of the Eurasian and African continents as a whole. If the U.S. is to find a solution to the inevitable early disasters caused by its present policies, this must include a special role for the Middle East. The approach to a solution to that strategic crisis does not lie in oil as such, but in the way petroleum production and marketing can be applied to serve the broader long-term interests of the region. Stable governments within the region and stable relations within areas outside the region are the first line of defense of the region from the forces and other perils which presently menace it. The crucial role of transport development is a leading example of the measures of defense required. The special advantage of modern rail or magnetic levitation, as compared with sea-based transport, lies in the elementary fact that with rare special exceptions, the product transported by sea does not improve in itself during transport. Under the right conditions, long-range transportation corridors, which are based on the central role of modern rail or magnetic levitation transport, are in net effect cheaper and faster routes of transport than the seas. As in the cases of the original U.S. transcontinental rail systems, these routes were not merely roads of transport. The transportation system transformed a virtual economic wasteland to a rich region of powerful economic development. In effect, every average kilometer or investment in the transportation system along these main and subsidiary routes gave back to the nation a net amount of produced wealth from agriculture, mining, and manufacturing far in excess of the cost of developing and maintaining the transportation system. Instead of thinking of connecting 2 points with a long-distance rail line or magnetic levitation system, think of the transport line as the central spine of a development corridor for up to 50 to 100 kilometers width. Running parallel to the spine are main line conduits of water and power. At appropriate places along the spine, agro-industrial residential complexes are built. Satellite areas of a similar type lie within the same corridor. What I have just described in a summary way is a modern equivalent of the methods which produced an agricultural industrial revolution in the United States approximately a century and a half ago. By concentrating resources of transportation, water, and power within development corridors, the most efficient use of these resources can be managed. The most economical use of the total available land area is achieved by tending to concentrate development in those corridors. Under conditions of continued growth, subsidiary development corridors will branch out from the principal ones. The same method can be applied with a combination of technologies either existing or within reach to transform the interior of Asia, including the deserts and tundras.
All right, so Harley, I know you have some limitations on your time today. Wanted to make sure that you got a chance to both respond to that. We also have Bill up for that, which is very good. Thanks, Bill, for being here. And so let's just get right now that response to what you just saw.
Well, it's really striking that if you think about what Lynn said in 2002, how relevant it is for the situation today. I mean, the discussion of water at the very beginning of that, water is the precious resource, which was part of his Oasis plan, which became part of the Oslo Accord. That's absolutely the case today. And what we're seeing is the use of water by Israel, or I should say the shutting off of water to Gaza as an instrument of war, when providing clean, fresh water is the basis of a cooperation for peace. So I think that's one point. Secondly, that was just a brilliant example of LaRouche economics. You know, the interconnection between infrastructure development as a product of human creativity, the idea of magnetically levitated transportation, and how that creates corridors of development from which you have intersection of cultures working together, again, is in the principle of the benefit of the other. And just the final thing, he only referenced it a little bit, but the discussion of geopolitics. How do you stop that kind of development, which seems to be a natural instinct for human beings? If you look at human history, we've always had the explorers and adventurers, and we're told now by modern historians that it was all about greed and corruption. But in fact, there were people who explored the world to find out what else there was there, who they could talk to, what they could discover. And the fact that Leibniz commented on the interesting phenomena of an advanced civilization in China, far away from Europe, as opposed to geopolitics, which divides countries up and people within countries up through a form of identity politics to allow for war to control the situation from the top. So that was just, I think, a beautiful example of the intervention of Lyndon LaRouche in world politics throughout his life. And it continues to reverberate today as the solutions that are needed, including what I was discussing in terms of the Westphalian principle, come right out of that idea of physical economy that we just heard from Lynn.
Okay, very good. So let me just know. So are you, is this pretty much the limitations of your time? You're going to have to get going, or do you have time for a question?
I can take a couple of questions.
Well, there's one here for you, and Bill will be able to do it. So I think we'll make that the segue. You'll see why. You'll see the nature of the question. And this is from JS. Don't know exactly who that is, but here's what he asks. I assume it's he. Why are we led by unprofessional politicians who are driven by hate and ego? What should we do to elect great minds like Jeffrey Sachs, James Mearsheimer, and others, members of the LaRouche team, many others who care about humanity? Why do EU countries have so many spineless and unprofessional politicians? How are they usually elected? Does Washington appoint these people? And I think yeah, that's basically the idea. Okay, so you can see why both of you will be able to answer the question. So go ahead.
Well, I think that gets to the question of the principle of tragedy. You could blame the leaders. You could say, why do we have a Biden? Why is there a Sunak? Why is there a Schultz? Why are there all these figures that seem to come to the top? And then the secondary question is how is it that this is related to the politics of greed and corruption, which it is. But the tragedy is not that we just have bad leaders. It's that these leaders reflect a population which has not taken upon itself the responsibility for self-government. The idea of a republic is institutions of self-government, where the people are involved, where there's a vigorous deliberative process. If you go back to the time of the American Revolution, the so-called Federalist Papers that were written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay were subject of intense debate. They were circulated as widely as possible, and people would sit down and argue about them the way today people argue about which college football team is number one. That's a different quality of culture. And it's what was defined in Plato's Republic as a republic protects itself by that kind of deliberative debate, Socratic dialogue. What happens now to suppress dialogue? If you criticize the policy of Netanyahu, and I would say that Netanyahu, I criticize Netanyahu not because he's Jewish, but because he's crazy, because he's a thug who believes in the power to impose your will on others. That's not anti-Semitic to say that he's a thug. That's a proper definition. And yet, if you say that, you risk being censored because they'll say, well, that's an anti-Semitic comment. Well, if that's the case, then probably 2/3 of the population of Israel is anti-Semitic, because the polls show that more than 2/3 of the population want to get rid of Netanyahu. So if you suppress discussion, or even if you start to censor so that people are afraid to speak their mind, and then you add to that the destruction of education, the destruction of education which starts from the standpoint of science, culture, economics. If you destroy that, you end up with a population that is tragic and is therefore doomed to be ruled by small-minded, corrupt individuals. And so the solution is not to say, why don't we just get rid of this guy and maybe someone else will come in. It's to become part of the new leadership, to make yourself capable of acting in the interests of the general welfare of the whole population. And that's a tough task, but I think that's why we have such bad leaders, because we've become bad citizens.
Okay, so Bill, before we go to your whole presentation, we want to get a response to your, what you just saw.
To Lynn's presentation. Yeah, the first thing that came to my mind, it takes me back further than that Dubai speech to the 1990s after the Oslo Conference, the Oslo Agreement between Palestine and Israel, which was organized really aside from the official organizations, but became then policy. On the basis of that, Lynn had put forward this proposal of the Oasis Plan to develop these irrigation channels, to create water projects, desalination for the entire Middle East, which would come to the benefit of the Palestinian people. This was accepted by the State of Israel. I remember posing the question to Clinton and to Rabin at the White House. Now that after the Oslo Agreement, now that we have this Oslo Agreement, what are we going to do about the economic development? And both of them, in their own way, said that this would be the next step that would be developed. What happened, of course, was a conference on creation of a Middle East Development Bank, which was then established and was meant to serve as the means of getting the credits to build these irrigation projects and roads and power plants and everything else that was needed. That was effectively sabotaged by the British through elements of the so-called economic division in the US State Department and elsewhere, who changed the notion of a development bank into a mercantile bank. They had to adhere to mercantile principles. That is, you couldn't simply spend money to build infrastructure unless there were assets and other things that were involved. and that thing never got off the ground. And that led, of course, later to the assassination of Rabin, which then upset the entire Middle East again. But that solution that LaRouche had posed and proposed again in a broader sense in Dubai had already been accepted by both parties, but it was undermined by the British, who didn't want this type of development to occur. And had that occurred, of course, you wouldn't have the awful situation that you have today with the genocidal, destruction of entire, neighborhoods of people, in one fell swoop. That could have been resolved already. The second thing I want to say briefly is that what Lynn was talking about is now being implemented to a large extent by the People's Republic of China. They did that to a large extent, I think, as a result of the activity of LaRouche and Helga in the conferences that we held on the Silk Road economic belt, and it was taken up in a big way by them. I don't think it would have happened without the atmosphere that had been created by Lin and by Helga then in China in 1996, which laid the basis for this type of a project, and it's ongoing. And it also has to do with the Westphalian principles that I can mention to you also as we go into this. So let me go over the visit by President Xi in
Just
San
before you do that,
Francisco.
Bill, let me just do one thing here. Sorry,
Sorry.
because Harley's gonna. It's okay. What I did, Harley, there were several questions. I'm combining them, so I've just got one, and then this will be your final exchange, and we'll get right to Bill's presentation. There were several different ones, but they came down to this: is there any way to cause a joint Palestinian-Israel movement, Israeli movement, to join with international forces to return to the Rabin-Arafat outlook?
Well, I would say there are people from Israel and from Palestine who have actually been trying to collaborate to do that. You see that in the work of some people in the United States. That's something that we're trying to pull together in the International Peace Coalition. But there's no reason why it couldn't happen. It was happening in the world of culture with Daniel Barenboim, with the Israeli Arab youth musicians who were performing concerts. There are many examples of this that I can't go through, offhand, but the willingness to do it is there. The problem is that the power that comes from the international community, largely dominated by the Anglo-American oligarchy, disallows it. So, we have to create these new institutions. At the time of Oslo, there were people who were working under Shimon Peres, who was the number 2 to Rabin in the Israeli government. Yuri Savir, people like that, were working with people who were assigned by Arafat, and they actually pulled together that kind of coalition, which drafted the Oslo Accord. That tendency still exists. So the question is, how do you build it? And that's what requires courage, it requires support, and it requires a change in the outlook in the Northern Hemisphere. Bill can go through extensively what's being done in the Global South in conjunction with China. I would say the early potential for that is there, but pulling it together, that's the difficult thing. And it really does require people of vision and people who have the courage to step forward along the lines of what Helga is doing every single day with interviews in China, with interviews around the world. It can be done, but it's going to require the work that we've been discussing.
Okay, thank you very much, Harley, and thank you very much, Bill, for being patient with this. We had some scheduling issues, and that's what we're going to do. So long. Thanks a lot. So just want to say one thing, Bill, before you get started, because some people joined us late, and if people didn't see the beginning of the program, Helga LaRouche, in an opening description, the actual briefing she gave yesterday, referenced that this week's meeting between President Xi Jinping of China and Joe Biden of the United States might possibly be some sort of respite from what was otherwise a careening force toward destruction. But we wanted to make sure we had Bill on just to discuss that event itself, its strategic context, and then from that standpoint, what might or might not be expected. So, Bill, thanks for joining us and thanks for your patience up through now. So, you have the floor. Take it.
Okay. Let me say just the following. I think that the visit itself was a game changer. Some people are saying it's a reset of the U.S. relationship. I don't know if that's the case, but obviously something significant has changed as a result of this. And it wasn't just the visit itself. Remember, the visit had been preceded by, during the last few months, by visits of all the major government ministers in the United States, the department heads, including the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, who came to the United States to visit, which created kind of the network of communications that had been broken down since the Bali summit between Biden and Xi, where there were also a lot of promises made that really weren't kept. But this was a intergovernmental process in which all of these departments then worked out something like a schedule of regular meetings that they would continue to hold going forward. So that kind of was the momentum building up to this summit meeting. The United States, of course, probably has its own reasons for improving the relationship. One is that it was leading to a very serious situation that could result in a military conflict in the Asia Pacific, and they probably wanted to avoid that, given that their hands are full with everything else going on in the world. Secondly, there were economic consequences of U.S. policy detrimental to the United States economy, and people were, of course, aware of that. He noted that when President Xi came, he was met by Janet Yellen, who was the Treasury Secretary, who has been most outspoken in terms of indicating problems with all of these sanctions on Chinese goods, problems for the American economy. But the second part of this, it was a major intervention by the president of China into the United States situation. And it was remarkable in many respects. He landed, of course, in San Francisco. San Francisco, they call in Chinese, Zhoujianshan. That means Old Gold Mountain, because San Francisco, for the Chinese, began with the gold rush and the influx of Chinese workers coming to California, not so much to look for gold, but to set up shop, for the gold miners, all the rush that was going on, and then became the source of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And he landed. There was a military cordon to meet him, an official reception. Janet Yellen, perhaps the most eager in the administration for improving relations with China, was at the head of that. Gavin Newsom, who had also been one of the people who went to China in the last couple of weeks, meeting with President Xi, talking about cooperation between California and China on the economic issue, was there, as well as the U.S. ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, and a number of other people. From the airport to his hotel, there were up on the streets of San Francisco the Chinese American, Asian American population in San Francisco, which is quite significant, flying, flags of China and flags of the United States as the cortege passed, going to the hotel. This we haven't seen in a very long time. Deng Xiaoping did that, of course, but Jiang Zemin, I guess, got something of a welcome as well. But this was something that was unprecedented, and people could see this. And this was an important development. At the meeting itself, it was a longer meeting of 4 hours and more. in which all the major issues were discussed. It was quite clear in the beginning when President Xi was making his opening remarks that he came here, in a spirit of friendship and cooperation to create the kind of relationship in which both countries could prosper in a mutually beneficial way. He also made the point that the major difference that existed between the Chinese and the American outlook was that the United States saw China as a rival, as a competitor, first and foremost, whereas China did not see the United States in that way, but saw it as a potential partner and friend. And these were the comments, of course, that were published. Biden was a little more circumspect. He greeted the meeting, said it was important. It was important that two countries should work together, etc. But nothing quite as eloquent as what President Xi had done. They did come to agreements. They had lengthy discussions on all major issues. The formal meeting of 4 hours, which was between, as far as I could see, was between the delegations as a whole. There were about, 6 or 7 people on each side in the discussions that they had in the formal meeting. After that, of course, President Xi was invited to a dinner by President Biden, which was probably a little more intimate, not the whole crowd of people, where they could discuss some of the other issues, including the major international issues that had been on the table, including the Gaza situation, the situation in Ukraine, and probably South China Sea. After which President Biden showed him the gardens of this estate, which was famous in American television history for housing the family in the TV show Dynasty, with the gardens, the English gardens and stuff that surrounding that, where I think they also could have a little bit more of a tete-a-tete discussion on major issues. They came out with a statement. There were a number of agreements that we know were made. One was that China was prepared to reestablish the military-to-military relations. You remember that in addition to all these other departments that had discussions, this did not include the Department of Defense and the PLA on the Chinese side. And of course, the U.S. has been pushing to establish these relations. The Chinese have been hesitant simply because they feel that the United States wanted to set what they call guardrails about what you couldn't do if things got difficult, and they felt that that would benefit the United States more than China, because the United States could, conduct increased freedom of navigation operations, and the Chinese would be restricted by agreements that they had made, in regard to how they should react. But now they have come to the point that they have agreed to that. That doesn't mean that they will agree to these guardrails or anything else. It'll simply mean that they have agreed to discuss these issues, so that on all levels now, these relations have been established. The other thing was that the U.S. had been pushing China to restrict the export of precursors to fentanyl. They don't export fentanyl. Nobody does that. But there were precursor drugs the United States was claiming were laying the basis for the production of fentanyl here in the United States, and the Chinese have agreed to do something, to work on counter narcotics together with the United States. That is, the two law enforcement agencies would now begin to cooperate at that level, and that's important. What the United States has given is still not exactly clear. There were discussions between the Secretary of Commerce, the Minister of Commerce in China, and the Secretary of Commerce here. Obviously, something is going to be happening. Maybe the U.S. doesn't want to say what it is because they feel they'll get attacked by the Republicans now in the election year on this issue. But obviously, the Chinese would not have gone to this the measure would not have agreed to the measure they're agreeing to unless they got something else. But it's not clear exactly what it was, except for the fact that both sides, and this is extremely important, both sides have agreed that there would be more exchanges on all levels between the United States and China. Students, tourists, institutions, cultural organizations visiting each other would now be more prevalent, and that the people to people relationship would be exceedingly strengthened, which is, I think, extremely important in the long term in this US China relationship. Now, in addition to the agreements that were made, President Xi uh, did a couple of things. And you have to remember that I think Xi Jinping is the one president of the People's Republic of China who probably knows the United States better than any other leader in China has known it. He was here as a young, uh, a young official working on agriculture, spent a lot of time in Iowa. We know the whole story. He made a lot of friends there. He was very happy about it, but he saw, I think, America in the heartland, which most Chinese leaders have not. His father probably helped, I think, set up that he would be brought here. His father also was a known Chinese official who had a certain understanding of America. But I think that created an understanding of the various forces at work here in America that many Chinese, looking at the news media, not having come to the United States, maybe having met some Americans, maybe having met some arrogant Americans, and creating a view of what the U.S. was, that he had a different view of that. And this was reflected in the speech that he gave. It was a dinner where he invited many of his old friends. Rick Kimberly, who was a farmer that he had met at 1985, was brought over here. China recently had a slew of visits on this people-to-people, a cultural exchange issue, including a visit by the Schiller Institute not too long ago, but also members of the Flying Tigers. A few of them are still alive. Members of their family are alive, still have a very fond view of China. They went over there. They met with officials there. This was played up big in the Chinese press to create a better understanding among the Chinese people of the diversity and the diverse views that exist within America in order to give them a better sense of it. Many of these people were brought to this dinner where she addressed primarily business people, and business people flocked to this event to hear what President Xi had to say. But he also invited his friends, his old friends, to come to that. And of course, that created a tremendous amount of publicity. People wanted to come and talk to him. You saw interviews with Flying Tigers on the press and in the media. And in his speech, it was quite clear that President Xi was aware that the basis of a long-term relationship with China would not necessarily only be dependent on the will of the sovereign or the will of President Biden or whoever it was. It would depend on a deeper support and understanding of what China was and what China wanted and what China hoped for among the American people. And he directed really his comments to the American public. I would say he didn't use these terms, but to the better angels of our nature, referring, of course, to the support that the United States had given China during World War II, the role of Claire Chennault, Joseph Stilwell, the American commander there, the Flying Tigers, all of this he showed as this was the great relationship and help that China has long had in its relationship with the United States. Let me just turn this off. Sorry. And he appealed to these people. He made very clear, he says, you know, you really have got to become activated on these issues, because the only real support that a stable US-China relationship would have is if it has the support of the people. And that includes, he had also people from the Philadelphia Orchestra, which had its first concert in China in the beginning of the opening up. They also had gone back to China this year to give a concert in honor of the 50th anniversary, whatever it was, of the orchestra's visit. They also were there at that conference. So he was here in a twofold way. One, he had a message to the government of the United States, to the political elites of the United States, and he had another message to the people of the United States, and to work together to try and create a kind of stability and understanding and idea of win-win cooperation that was necessary in order for the United States and China both to prosper. In one sense, he was presenting the Westphalian principles to the American public: non-interference, mutual cooperation, and mutual respect, and win-win solutions. This was his message. Now, he was doing this, of course, at an APEC conference, which in itself was very significant. This is the 30th anniversary of the first APEC meeting in Seattle, where after all of this, you know, with the disturbance of U.S.-China relations after Tiananmen, was the first time that the Chinese leader, Jiang Zemin, came to meet with President Bill Clinton. And this, of course, was creating APEC, which was considered the organization of economic cooperation between the nations of the Asia-Pacific region. And so that also was part of the theme of the 30th anniversary issue, that we must maintain this notion of solidarity, cooperation, and goodwill among nations in the Asia-Pacific as it was created at the original APEC meeting 30 years ago. He also used the occasion, of course, to talk to all of the other people who were on this issue, and that was you know, Peru, the Southeast Asian countries were involved, as well as some of the other countries in the region, all of whom were oriented towards creating a situation of mutual cooperation, many of whom had already benefited from this Belt and Road Initiative. I should close that landline. They're all crazy calls anyhow. So it was a situation in which the theme of this conference was sustainability and inclusiveness. And that was the theme that was supported by the United States, so that it would have been very difficult for President Biden to come in and to say, we want this coalition of democracies, this exclusive small group of people in the Asia Pacific, to become the basis of our cooperative relationship. He couldn't do that. You know, the United States has a policy officially that they want to create the alliance of democracies within the Asia Pacific, and it's an initiative that is focused on economic development, and they call it the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. That would mean the criteria for this framework was of such a nature, such a restrictive nature, that China, with its system, would not be a part of it. And of course, that was clearly aimed at, you know, economic containment. They couldn't really do that in this kind of climate. In fact, ironically, President Biden is going to have trouble doing this because of opposition within the Democratic Party, some of whom think that the criteria are not strict enough and that it has to be changed. So he was kind of had his focus on the back foot here because he couldn't do what he otherwise might want to do. So I think that the benefit of this went totally in the direction of what China was trying to create. And the final message that President Xi sent to this conference was that we must have a stable and economically viable Asia Pacific region. That means that there must be stability in the supply chains, stability in the economic cooperation, unity in regard to the so-called rules and regulations that are applicable to all and in which all are included. So I think that we've gotten to a point where President Xi has succeeded in introducing a counterpoint to the policies of recrimination and hegemony that the United States has been imposing, which have led to the crisis in Ukraine and into this terrible genocidal massacre in Gaza. The ability of China coming out of APEC in terms of having introduced that message of unity in the Asia Pacific also gives them, I think, the capabilities of operating globally now in terms at least of trying to get an end to this crisis in Gaza. And they, of course, have been in the forefront in the United Nations and elsewhere in calling for calling for a ceasefire and a peaceful resolution, diplomatic resolution of the crisis. In the communique that was issued by the APEC, I don't think there was any direct reference to Gaza. However, some of these nations, Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia, have clearly made statements that there must be a ceasefire. I think they had to issue these statements independently in the context of the APEC meeting. And of course, you had countries like Japan and perhaps the Philippines who wouldn't go along with that. So there's no possibility to do that, and the United States to do that in the APEC communique. But there was discussion of this and there was action taken. And I think what we will see coming out of this is the fact that China will be in a much greater role in being able to push forward those policies that can help deal with these two major crises. Remember that it was the tensions in U.S.-China relations that created a situation that hamstrung, to some extent, China's ability and influence in the world. To the extent that those tensions are even relaxed, and how it's going to go going forward, I think it's going to be still going in terms of agreements that they would have in resolving some of these major issues. But the fact that it is no longer at a point of maximum, conflict, a lot of the other nations are going to be feel freer to do what they think is right, and most of them are supportive of what China has been doing, and probably most or if not all of the countries in Africa at this point, as well as in Asia, would adhere to this notion of a system based on peaceful resolution, mutual benefit, and win-win cooperation. I think for us here, it presents interesting opportunities to mobilize people around the policies that, similar to the Belt and Road policies, the economic development policies that China has been pushing, because there will be more interaction between the United States and China. There will be more delegations going back and forth, maybe more opportunities like the Schiller Institute delegation had in going to China, many Chinese delegations here, many opportunities to discuss with people these issues. And that's, of course, what's going to change the situation. As Harley emphasized, it really lies with the people standing up, standing tall, and saying, we have to have a change here. And now we have a situation in which the boundaries or the restrictions that have been placed on this international travel and international coordination have now to a large extent been lifted, in which we have a greater opportunity to do something like that. And just to end this with regard to this question that was raised about, the nature of our politicians, that on the one hand it demands the people beginning to act, to mobilize, to do things with their feet and not simply talk, but also it means that we can either get to our politicians to begin to listen to reason by political pressure, or people can also, like Diane Sayre, run for office and contest this, make these issues into major political issues that can make or break an election. And in that way, we can change this situation around. I think that the visit of Xi was very important. It has given us, I think, a new opportunity for doing something concrete on all of these issues. And I think it has also strengthened the situation of China and the policy that has been put forward by the People's Republic of China, which effectively is the Westphalian principle on a global scale. That is, the dialogue of cultures, the global civilization initiative, the global security initiative, and the global development initiative are all combined, I think, in a larger context of a Westphalian solution for the world as a whole. And I think we now have possibilities of moving forward because of the reaction to the system as people know it, the system which has brought us war, destruction, and the deaths of thousands of people on a daily basis. And I think people are tired of it, and they just need a solution and a guide. And this is really what we have to provide for them.
Thank you, Bill. We have a few questions for you. This one is from Erica. She says this, or asks this. She says, China is a continental nation. Russia is a continental nation. America is a continental nation. India and Brazil have the qualities of continental nations. And so when you look at the BRICS and you look at those various nations, there is something that is common. But when we are talking about the continent of Africa, which is as big as India, the United States, and China combined, there are no continental nations. South Africa is a very special case, and Nigeria is a very different special case. Many countries are talking about involvement in Africa, but China has tried to pursue a different policy than those that prevailed earlier, meaning the colonial policies. So it's a two parts to the question. What is the difference in diplomacy between continental nation to continental nation, the large nations like Russia and China, China and the United States, United States and China, and diplomacy conducted with among other states and with other states? That's the first part of the question. What's the difference in diplomacy, if there's any? And second, how do you avoid continental nations conflicting interests from adversely affecting Africa if they are all involved in trying to do things there, even if the policies are not imperialistic?
Well, let me answer the first question first. I think that the policies you'd have with country to country, of course, would be on the same footing. The idea that, as the Chinese have said, that mutual benefit. Each country has its own program. Each country has its own pathway that they have worked out toward development. If you talk to the various countries, they'll tell you, oh, it's our plan 2030 or plan 2040. This is what we want to do. And so that anything coming from the outside, in terms of this is the principle also of the Belt and Road, should be coordinated with what the country itself wants to do. Now, in the situation of Africa, you've got a particular constellation of forces which are somewhat different because of the many countries they're diverse, but also many of them extremely poor. So that the development of Africa, at least you talk sub-Saharan Africa, will require more of a, I would say, regional outlook than simply a country to country outlook. You have to have corridors of trade. And corridors of trade would not simply be from, one boundary of a country to the next, but you'd have to think in terms of regional connectivity. Because it's only when you can increase the basis of trade on a larger level that you have the ability of each and every country being able to contribute what other countries may need, what it can produce, and what other countries can it will need. You have that in China to some extent. I mean, you have it's a very large country. It's been very separated. It is one nation. There's one governing body, one language, etc. But there were a lot of diverse areas which were extremely isolated and could not develop on their own. So what China had done through this transport grid was to create the basic connectivity needed to economically bring the country together. And then on that, they brought together everything else, the fiber optics, the internet, so that the little village in this almost inaccessible little village in a mountain area could then produce whatever it was producing on a larger scale and use the internet and use the new connectivity to get their goods out to the entire country. That same principle is going to have to be used in Africa because the centers of development are limited basically to Nigeria, South Africa. It's in sub-Saharan Africa. In Northern Africa, it's a little bit different. And these would be the nodes. Lyndon LaRouche pointed this out earlier in his program of Africa, building the railroad north-south and east-west, and then bringing the countries together economically. Different nations, of course, but you're bringing them together economically because it's only on that basis that you can have the extensive economic potential, economic market for production in each and every one of these locations. And this is generally the way that the Africans see this. This is definitely the way that South Africa sees it. That it is, it has a lot of capabilities, but it's also responsible for a lot more countries. And you will see, in addition to a lot of the developed scientific capabilities they have in space, in astronomy, one of the most advanced astronomical mechanisms there in the desert, which is connected to a worldwide system, together with the massive poverty, because you have people from Zimbabwe and elsewhere coming to South Africa, living in shanty towns essentially, because there's nothing for them in their own countries, and they're in a situation where it's much better in South Africa in spite of the poverty that exists in these shanty towns than it is back home. And the government of South Africa is aware of this. This is why it's always in their planning is the idea that they must also extend that reach of development that they have achieved to other countries. They did this, for instance, in the space program. When South Africa first decided to have an international space conference in South Africa, they submitted their request for Cape Town being the location of this on behalf of all of Africa. And at the space conference, all the African nations sent representatives to talk about, how they could use space, satellites, remote sensing, all of these things they needed for their economic welfare. That's the way it has to be developed there. And it's not unlike dealing with a so-called continental nation, in spite of the fact that they have more of an economic ponderance in themselves to move forward, whereas many of these other nations don't have that. But also in these continental issues, it is not restricted to nation building. If we look at, for instance, the development of Brazil, it's existing within all of South America, and they must have these connections to these other countries in order really to fully develop their own economic potential. So the policy is not much difference, and the basis is that you have to look at the Westphalian principle. What is the good of the other? What do they want to do, and how can we help them do it? And then on that basis, launch these kind of development projects.
Okay, so there's another question. This is from Greg, and he asks this. What's the story about China's involvement, especially with Israel, for example, in building ports in the Middle East, as well as talking with Saudi Arabia and Iran? Was any of this a factor, or is it at least a consideration in what we are seeing in the possibilities of escalating conflict in that area?
Well, China has had a good relationship with Israel as well. I mean, they've worked with them on many different issues, and but they are absolutely opposed to the present Israeli policy, and they will do everything, I think, to try and create the basis for a peaceful resolution. And now the Israeli government, of course, is not at all interested in that. I don't think China will have the greatest influence on convincing them in doing that. I think most of that is going to happen here in the United States as the pressure grows on the U.S. government to do something to stop this genocide. I think that's the only thing that's really going to get things to change. The Europeans also, it could play a role, but it's really the U.S. at the point that there seems to be the possibility of some kind of negotiation. Um, I think the Chinese will do everything that they've done earlier. That they would extend the Belt and Road Initiative into these areas. They also have had, a lot of contact on the West Bank and also in Gaza. I mean, there were a lot of Chinese citizens that had to be brought out of Gaza as this thing started coming down, so that they have good relations with that. But their policy is that they would work with both parties at the point where there's a possibility of negotiation. Prior to that, they will work in order to see to it that the fighting will stop. If that answers the question. Let me
Yeah,
just
I
mention
think.
another thing. Well,
Go ahead.
just another thing in regard to what Helga said about this, the comment by Biden that she was a dictator. Um, this is a comment that got Anthony Blinken to cringe. This was on the YouTube all the time. As soon as he could see, oh my God, everything is going to fall apart because of. And he was answering a question: do you still see him as a dictator? What's he going to say? I mean, he's not a dictator. You know what's going to happen there. And I think the Chinese understood that because they understand the game that's going on here. So I don't think that was a game breaker, but even Tony Blinken was a little bit shocked to see that. Okay, I just
Yeah.
wanted to
No,
comment on
no,
that.
it is an important comment. A lot of people are seeing this, and there's all these sort of gurgling about the 25th Amendment and so on. But it's always humorous to see the would-be puppeteers suddenly freak out in public that way. So, Bill, that's pretty much it. If there's any final comments that you have that you'd like to make, we're pretty much at time and we're coming to our end. So, anything that.
Well, I would just back up that what Harley said about the this Westphalia principle. I mean, this is what we're looking at. Is the only solution. I mean, the geopolitical games that have been played. I'm on top and you're on the bottom, or I'm better than you, at an international level, this world is over, because it can only lead to total catastrophe. And I think if you look, and people look at the speeches of Xi and other things that he's saying, you will find very clearly that, and now even the Chinese are talking about the Westphalia Principle. For a while, they didn't do that. Maybe didn't see the relationship to it in terms of their socialism with Chinese characteristics. But it is really effectively the same, and it is a going policy. It is not simply a devout wish, or a maxim that should be followed. It is reality in a large part of the world, and I think it's making itself felt very strongly, and we'll see more after the meeting. Peru also is building this large port with Chinese help, which would extend the Pacific trade in the APEC region. And I think if people understand that, they will understand better, how false and how phony and how ridiculous and this narrative of China in the mass media is, and just reject it fully, and begin to mobilize, to support a process of reason, which has been put forward by the Chinese government in terms of this the world situation today.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Bill, for being with us today. And we're at our conclusion. So, again, thank you very much. We want to just again announce for people, because we got some questions about it, the emergency forum of November 26th, No More War Crimes, Economic Development, Not Depopulation. Speakers include Helga LaRouche, founder of the Schiller Institute, and Ray McGovern, co-founder of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. We also stated that we are going to be, after that event has its discussion as a kind of part two, there'll be a showing of the movie Hiroshima 8:15, and I think 8:15 a.m. It's taken from a narrative written by Dr. Akiko Mikamu, and I understand we have the trailer, I think, of the film, so we're going to just show that so people have a sense of what the film does.
私は三上真嗣と申します。許す心というのはね。
We heard their screams. We tasted the ash. It was hell on earth.
もう何と苦しゅうても痛うても生きるという望みを捨てたらダメだ。お父さんがおらんかったら俺はそこで死んどるやろうね。許す心を成し遂げたらみんなが平和になりますよね。
And to be able to see the film, you'll have to register for that. You go onto our site, or actually, I think if you put information in the chat, so you can just go there and take a look at that. I just want to say here that there's an article that appeared just yesterday in the British publication, The Lancet. This is a medical journal that was founded 200 years ago in 1823. And they had an article, which is a special editorial, or op-ed, called Save the Remaining People of Gaza, Save the Children. This is not the entire article, this is just an excerpt. We're going to just read to you. An immediate ceasefire in Gaza is an urgent priority, which is a sentiment echoed in Gaza and around the globe. Governments and leaders must understand that Palestinians are in the middle of a genocide. They must stop the massacres of innocent civilians in Gaza, including children. Quote, mankind owes to the child the best that it has to give. End quote. With these words, on September 26, 1924, the League of Nations adopted the Geneva Declaration of the Rights of the Child, a common goal across all humanity. According to the Gazan Ministry of Health, as of November 7th, 2023, 10,328 people on the Gaza Strip have been killed, including 4,237 children, 2,719 women, and 613 older people. In addition, 25,956 people have been injured, and 2,450 are missing, including 1,350 children, mostly covered by some of the 262,000 damaged housing units. So far, 192 medical staff have been killed. Crucial health infrastructure is damaged. 120 health institutions and 40 ambulances have been destroyed, and 18 hospitals and 40 primary health centers are out of service because of targeting or the depletion of fuel and electricity. It is highly likely that almost all Gazan children have been exposed to traumatic events. Childhood trauma is particularly severe because it affects the developmental processes, putting children at risk of developing PTSD, anxiety, depression, and other psychiatric disorders. Accordingly, there are an estimated 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza who could transfer mental health problems to the next generations. Children's mental health was already at a breaking point before the current war, with reports of 80% having mental distress, 79% experiencing bedwetting, and 59% having reactive mutism. In the past 6 weeks, we have witnessed that a group of Israeli medical doctors support the IDF in bombing hospitals in Gaza. These attitudes in the slaughter of thousands of children uncover a complete absence of humanity. The meaning of humanity in a conflict setting is to prevent and alleviate suffering wherever it is found, to protect life and health, and to ensure respect for the human being. Right now, that means stopping the war. We as human beings must regain our humanity for the sake of the next generation. We declare no competing interests. So that's from the Lancet again of yesterday. Yesterday, at the conclusion of the meeting of the International Peace Coalition, Helga LaRouche was asked the question, what is it actually going to take to cause this situation to be different, to be resolved, to be overcome? Because there are demonstrations and there are statements and there are many different ways in which people are expressing their outrage or this disagreement. There are attempts to get resolutions through at the United Nations. There are individual heads of state who call for ceasefires. And so she had an answer, and we're going to play that for you for our conclusion.
I mean, when I suggested this new security and development architecture for the whole world, this was shortly after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. It was very clear that, as important all the issues are, the NATO expansion. I mean, there are many failures of the West to prevent this war from breaking out, the condoning of the Maidan coup, the conscious sabotage of the Minsk agreement, which was even admitted by Merkel and former President Hollande from France, that they only pro forma did the Minsk negotiation in order to give Ukraine more time to go for more training and armament. I mean, there are many reasons which are in the specifics, in the specifics of NATO, Russia, Ukraine. The same for sure is true for Southwest Asia, the conflict between Israel, Palestine, Sykes-Picot. You can go a long time back into history. And you can say the same thing for Cameroon and many places in Africa, or Latin America for that matter, or Germany, or even the United States. You can always find historic specific histories and reasons. But it was clear to me then, and I think it has become clearer since, that when you are in a situation like the one we are presently in, where you are dealing with a systemic collapse of an order. The system which started to really emerge after Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold standard and went to floating exchange rates, in this way abandoning the Bretton Woods system. My late husband, in a really prophetic way, said, if they keep going on this trajectory, it will lead to a new fascism, a new depression, and the danger of a new world war, or else you have a completely different economic system. And in the many decades since, he and our whole movement, we followed this development, and you can actually see that this effort to have a system which is for the profit of a small elite, the financial oligarchy, those people who, in a certain sense, can afford to speculate, that order is definitely coming to an end. And, the $4 quadrillion in outstanding derivative contracts, which cannot be settled, even if you pump money like waterfall, you cannot do it. And against that, you have the rising other system of countries who want to end colonialism of 600 years, who are organized in different forms, in the BRICS Plus, in the SCO, in some other organizations, but essentially the global South, breaking the agreement to be submitted to this colonial system for good. That's the real conflict behind all of these situations. President Putin recently said that one should look at the string pullers of the conflict in Southwest Asia. And I think that is exactly the case, and what some of the people from Pax Christi were saying about the merchants of death. They are part of these string pullers because they are part of the people who profit from all of this. So I think that in order to address that in a way which really works, you cannot, when you have a breakdown crisis of a system, and this manifests itself in many different appearances, you cannot try to deal with this problem and that problem and this problem and that problem, because it's like, you have a whole, after a car accident, a person is losing his head, his legs and his arms. You cannot go there with a Band-Aid and say, I'll fix it. You have to somehow remedy the whole situation by not having the car accident maybe in the first place. And that's why I'm absolutely certain that the only way how we can solve all of these regional problems, as important their history may be to the people who are directly involved in it, you have to change the axioms which are the cause of the entire dilemma. And that is why I think we should really concentrate on the need to have a new security and development architecture which takes into account the security interest of every single country on the planet. And that is possible, I think, was powerfully demonstrated by the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 150 years of religious war in Europe, with 4 years of negotiations from 1644 to 1648. But they produced principles which were absolutely valid, namely that if you want to have peace, you have to take into account the interest of the other. And if you want to have peace, you have to replace hatred with love. Now that may sound like an impossible task, but I think it is absolutely true, because if you do not replace the feeling of vengeance and tooth for a tooth and eye for an eye, then you will not solve the problem, and you will be for eternity be played by those string pullers who have a vested interest to do so. I think that the idea to have a completely new system which takes care of all people is eminently possible. I try to initiate this discussion by suggesting these 10 principles, which are essentially, I think, dealing with the most important issues, which are absolutely indispensable to be addressed. and especially the last three principles, which are more pertaining to the needed philosophical change in the outlook of countries and people who want to solve this problem. So I would really suggest, again, please look at the discussion about this new security and development architecture, and also the 10 principles. And since we have now a date for the upcoming conference, basically is the key point in Nicaragua, but reaching out to many universities in all kinds of countries, help us to make this a real glamorous event. Reach out to your university, to think tanks who you think should be involved in this discussion. And then let's make that a Paukenschlag. I mean, this is only, less than 3 weeks, or maybe exactly 3 weeks away. And if we use the invitation, which has been already provided, to really address, the need to have such a conference with the urgency of the ongoing, nobody can deny anymore, that there is an effort to depopulate Gaza. I mean, what else do? You first tell the people from the north that they all have to go to the south, and barely have they arrived there without water, without food. The World Food Program just put out today a statement that the entire population in Gaza has only 7% of the food and water they would need. Now that means people are slowly starving, dying from a lack of water, but they are dying. Every minute we are talking here, they are dying as a result of this policy, which is now going on for almost 6 weeks. So I think that we have to really make a gigantic effort. If we would turn this conference in Nicaragua, or centered in Nicaragua, into a worldwide outcry from many universities, think tanks, other civil groups, religious groups, fold everything into a cry, we need a new system which is giving justice to everybody, because we cannot address all the many problems in a breakdown crisis. These problems will become, multiple and more. So you have to go to the roots of the matter, and you have to put in a system which allows for the survival of every single human being on the planet. And if that becomes the momentum of the majority, I think you can contain and sort of deal with all the individual problems, because the whole world will be on one course of solving the big one, and then you can solve all the little problems, which are not so little, obviously, but if you address the large issue, this is the injustice of the system, then you have a hope that you can deal with all the other problems. So my appeal emphatically would be to all of you, help organizing this event in a major fashion.